The strange body that melted. I'm Franco, and today I'll tell you about a case that happened in a morgue in the United States, specifically in Oklahoma, where my friend Alfred worked. Honestly, it seemed like a very strange and uncommon case, not to mention how terrifying it was. So many things happen in morgues that it's always interesting to hear about them, but I can't imagine witnessing a similar situation, as I feel I wouldn't handle the shock. This is how it happened. They were in the morgue one night, working as usual, when someone knocked on the door and told them that a body had been delivered. They hurried to receive it, and all they knew was that a group of men dressed as nurses had brought the body. They supposedly had identification badges, which they didn't get a chance to see as they quickly left in a white van with no logo or anything distinctive. When they started working on the body, they saw a man who appeared to be in his mid-30s, slim, and seemingly athletic. They needed to determine the cause of death because no information was provided when the body was delivered. From the beginning, everything was totally strange, and they didn't know who he was as there was nothing in his clothes that could explain his identity, address, or name. Despite the unusual nature of the case, they had to continue their work as they couldn't leave the body exposed for too long, so they had to hurry to find out the cause of this strange man's passing. Normally, they always knew who the deceased were and their causes of death, but this time, it was a real mystery. According to what Alfred told me, up until that point, everything seemed apparently normal, with no signs of injuries, lack of air, or accidents, and no external traces. Though there could be many internal causes, they proceeded with the examination. While Alfred was telling me this story, I noticed a certain nervousness in his hands, and he made some pauses as if he were recalling all the events of that occasion little by little. This time, he seemed affected, sometimes fearful or scared. The strangeness of the case was evident even in his tone of voice, as if he himself refused to believe it, but he continued telling me. As they examined his organs, they noticed that everything seemed to be in order, but something about his heart seemed very odd, and especially his liver. The man's liver had a peculiar color, something like a bluish-green tone, and his lungs had a grayish hue. This was honestly very bizarre, so they took some tissue samples since it was evident that this was the cause of his demise, as those colors in his organs were far from normal. As embalmers, they were familiar with the colors of organs depending on the causes of death. For example, if it was the lung of a smoker, it would be very dark, but according to what Alfred told me, he had never seen organ tones like those during all the time he had worked at the funeral home. After they collected the samples of these strange tissues, they proceeded as usual to send them to a laboratory for examination by a doctor. Later on, they closed the body, followed the necessary protocols, and placed it in a drawer to wait in case someone identified him. If that happened, they would finally know who he was and where that person came from. Once the samples were sent to the laboratory, they waited to find out the causes that led to the man's death. Alfred told me that the body had been in the drawer for 2 days at that point, and so far, no one had come forward to claim it. They would have to wait a little longer, and Alfred and his colleagues continued with their work because, unfortunately, there is no rest in morgues. Unintentionally, they momentarily forgot about the strange body in one of their drawers. On the 3rd day at that place, something disturbing would happen. One of Alfred's colleagues would check on the man's body, as they needed to see its condition. If they hadn't found any relatives by that point, they would have to embalm it to prevent decomposition, since even though it was in the freezer, they still had to periodically check it as the time to remove it would come. When Alfred's colleague opened the drawer, the man looked intact, or at least that's how it seemed. There were no changes so far, and everything appeared to be in order. He didn't want to touch it to avoid disturbing what appeared to be fine, so he closed the drawer, and they continued with their routine. The next day, they received a call from the laboratory where they had sent the tissue samples, and that's when everything started. Alfred said that during that call, they were informed that they would need another set of identical samples because the ones they sent had strangely disintegrated. Yes, you heard that right. They had liquefied, which was very unusual. It wasn't the first time they had sent samples when they weren't sure of the cause of damage, as they needed to provide the best explanation to the families. However, what they heard on the other end of the line was far from common: human tissue samples liquefying. It was truly something hard to believe. They reported this to the medical examiner in charge of the morgue, and their boss instructed them to take new samples, as this was certainly not a usual occurrence. Maybe due to the strange circumstances surrounding this body, they would have to do the work again. They had also frozen the organs with the peculiar colors. So they went to where they had stored the remains and took more samples to send back to the laboratory. This time, they noticed that the parts were much softer, and the previously strange colors had slightly changed to a lighter shade. As they were about to close and seal the containers for shipment, they wondered about the identity of the man they received a few days earlier. It was very strange that no one had inquired about him yet. According to Alfred, he arrived in regular clothes with no identification, and they had no information about the people who left him there with them. He also wasn't sure if their bosses had planned this and were keeping it hidden. Before sealing the samples, Alfred could see, inside the special containers, the samples starting to melt as if they were ice cream under the scorching sun, turning into a pool of foamy liquid. It was genuinely horrible, as Alfred described it, and he showed me his arm hair standing on end as he recalled that scene, saying, "I feel the same way on my neck." It was like he was reliving it again. It left an impression on me that I can't forget, and it led me to quit that job. He continued with his account. They kept looking at the man, and he was melting as if he were a candle or as if you passed a flame over a wax figure. Slowly, he was liquefying, and drops formed a pool of disgusting foamy slime. Apart from the shock, we were filled with horror and disgust. Even though we were used to seeing many things, like accident victims in all forms, we had never seen anything like this. We couldn't understand how a body could melt like that. The most astonishing part was that the body completely melted away, leaving no bones, just that strange and viscous liquid on the floor, emitting a foul odor. Alfred continued, saying we didn't know what to do, so we informed the authorities because we couldn't identify him anymore. There was no way. We only had that liquid on the floor, and the samples never reached the laboratory. We were clueless until that moment, and everything was out of our hands. We called the laboratory to ask if they could analyze any remains. They had to find out what was going on since the same thing happened with the organs and the body. We hurried to collect some samples as the liquid was spreading horribly across the floor. We couldn't leave it like that because it was seeping out of the drawer, and we were at risk of slipping. So we had to hurry to clean up, but not before taking photographs of the event to document what happened and, I believe, to preserve our sanity, to ensure that we weren't imagining it. Even in our worst nightmares, we would have never thought of something like this. Cleaning and decontaminating the entire room was an ordeal, truly grotesque. We had to pick up pieces of what used to be the left or right side of a person, now turned into liquid. But in the end, we had to do it. We made several trips to the bathroom, struggling with nausea as we cleaned. Our stomachs couldn't handle it. I was imagining all of this as Alfred was narrating it, as I wouldn't have the stomach to do the work they did. And that's not where it all ended. He continued with his terrifying story, wiping drops from his forehead with a napkin as he sipped his coffee to continue. After they finished cleaning, He said they stored the samples they had taken in a refrigerator and were waiting for the laboratory's response and what the authorities would say about this matter. A couple of days passed, and finally, the laboratory's response arrived. They mysteriously reported that the samples had disappeared and no one knew who had taken them. They checked the laboratory's cameras and only saw a couple of men in white walking, apparently carrying nothing in their hands. The worst part was that there were many similar-looking people, and seeing them only from behind made identification very difficult since they were all dressed alike. The worst was yet to come. The samples they had stored in the morgue disappeared under similar circumstances. When they went to check the samples, they found only empty containers. When they reviewed the cameras, they saw static for a few seconds, it disappeared, and everything looked normal again. No one was seen entering or leaving. Alfred's narrative concluded, and they never found out who the man was who arrived that night or who left him at the morgue and why. The authorities found nothing relevant because it seems those who brought him had a motive. Both Alfred and the people who experienced this determined that they needed a place to leave the body where it wouldn't be on the street or in a place where many people could see what would happen to this strange man. People would panic, and it would become headline news, raising many questions. The truth would be hard to ignore, but we will never know who he was or where he came from. Possibly, the government is concealing things that are better left unknown for now. The funeral hearse. This story was told to me by a friend who works in a funeral home. The events happened in Mexico City, where my friend unfortunately experienced many events in that funeral home to his terror. My name is Cesar, and this is the first of the terrifying experiences that he lived while working at the funeral home. My friend's name is Alejandro, and he perfectly remembers each and every one of the paranormal events at that job. One afternoon, Alejandro and I met up after a while of not seeing each other. He invited me for lunch, and luckily I didn't have to work that day. I just had a few errands to run. We met in the city center, and as we all know, there are plenty of restaurants and eateries around there. So, I accepted his invitation, and we found a small place where we could catch up on what was happening in our lives. We entered a restaurant and started chatting while waiting for our food to arrive. After talking about many things, we got to the topic of our jobs. I was particularly interested when he told me he had worked in a funeral home just a couple of months ago. Of course, I couldn't miss the opportunity to ask him what it's like to work in such a place. Naturally, one has many questions about it, and while sipping our drinks and eating, we discussed some everyday things. He told me that it is indeed true what is said about those places, that there are unexplainable occurrences. That afternoon, he shared a case with me, and now I'll share it with you. Alejandro said that one morning they had to take a coffin to the municipal cemetery. It was a young lady, about 20 years old, slender, as he had seen the day before during the wake. The sadness on the girl's face was evident, and he even thought she looked that way because, he assumed, she had passed away at an age when she had her whole life ahead of her. The family was devastated, and understandably so. Alejandro and two other colleagues went to get the casket to place it in the funeral hearse. They entered the funeral home, where the family members of the deceased girl were still gathered, and with all the respect they should have, they asked for permission to take the young lady and place her in the hearse. As you know, before doing that, they had to remove the candles and the wheeled bases to take out the coffin. They did so, and up to that point, everything was in order. He even mentioned that they had to close the lid of the coffin as it was still open, and they could see the girl through the glass. As they lifted the coffin and placed it on the base to carry it outside, they began to feel that it weighed a little more as they moved it. They thought that maybe the base was the reason why it felt so heavy for the young lady. Perhaps one of the wheels was faulty or stuck, although it was very strange because it wasn't the first time they used it. They arrived at the funeral hearse, and a colleague opened it and positioned himself on the right side, while Alejandro was on the left side, and the other colleague stood behind to push the casket. This way, the three of them would place the coffin into the hearse. However, when they lifted the casket to put it in, they could feel even more weight than they had previously sensed, as if they were carrying a person much heavier than the young lady, almost like someone weighing around 80 kilograms. They made the effort, said Alejandro, but they couldn't do it until another worker noticed the situation and helped them finally lift it. They closed the back door of the hearse and got inside to head to the cemetery. In the front, Alejandro and another colleague got in, while the third one had to stay behind to finish some tasks and wait until all the family members left for the cemetery. Besides, they were already expected at the cemetery to help them lower the casket. There was a comment that one of the colleagues whispered to them before saying goodbye to return to his work at the funeral home, and it resonated in the minds of those men who embarked on the journey to the young lady's final resting place. He said, "She weighs so much because she doesn't want to leave yet." He knew it was one of the ways the deceased refused to depart to their eternal rest. This colleague who made the comment was a mature man who had been working at the funeral home for a long time, but at first, they didn't pay much attention to it and continued on their way to the cemetery as they had to arrive at a certain time. Alejandro recalls that there wasn't much traffic that day, but as they continued, something strange started happening to the hearse. It would jerk every once in a while, as if it wanted to stall or something similar. This was undoubtedly very odd, and they feared it might break down. They decided that as soon as they could stop, they would check what was happening. The strange thing was that the hearse hadn't had any problems before, and it was functioning normally the day before without any issues. They started to worry as they drove a little further until they found a place to pull over and see what was going on. They got out to check the engine, looking for any disconnected coils or issues, but everything seemed to be in perfect order. They even considered finding a nearby workshop to have it checked, thinking maybe they hadn't noticed a problem. The most uncomfortable part was when one of the mourners got out of one of the accompanying cars and asked what was happening. Alejandro explained what had occurred, and as the procession of cars had already formed behind them, he reluctantly suggested that they go ahead to the cemetery and that they wouldn't take long to catch up. The mourners reluctantly followed his advice. Then, the colleague remembered the words of the older man who suggested that the young lady might not want to leave yet. When this thought crossed his mind, he thought about trying something, not knowing if it would work or not. He told Alejandro that he wanted to attempt something, and Alejandro shrugged, telling him to go ahead. After all, they needed to keep moving and reach the cemetery. They got back into the hearse, and the colleague turned around to speak, saying, "Miss, allow us to take you to a place where we know no one wants to go, but it is necessary, and your family is waiting for you there. Please help us get there. We need to do our job. Come on." After finishing these words, he looked at my friend Alejandro. He was left wondering why the colleague had done that. Could it be true what the other colleague had said? After all, the older man told him they had nothing to lose by trying. They waited for a while, and then the colleague told Alejandro to try starting the engine again, but not before saying to the lifeless body behind them, "Miss, let's go now." Then, he made a gesture to Alejandro to proceed to start the engine and continue their way to the cemetery. Alejandro did as instructed, and to his surprise, the hearse moved forward smoothly again. My friend said he was truly surprised, but it was time to keep going because, despite everything, he feared that the hearse might stall again. So, he hurried to reach the cemetery. When they finally arrived, they registered to enter the cemetery and hand over the coffin to the people waiting there. Once everything was ready, they opened the hearse and placed the bases to pull the coffin out. Alejandro got back inside the back to push the casket while his colleague and the other men waited. With a superhuman effort, he pushed the casket, and although the men who were supposed to pull it made another enormous effort, the coffin still weighed too much. Among the three of them who were at the bottom, they began to pull, but even with Alejandro getting back down to help, the four of them couldn't move the casket. It was too heavy. Even one of the cemetery workers said, "The man they are carrying must be very heavy," but all of them insisted that it was a slender young lady, not weighing as much anymore, and again thinking about what had happened earlier, Alejandro's colleague made a signal and approached the coffin. He whispered something very softly, and after a while, he told everyone, "Pull again, let's see if we can lower the casket now." They did as instructed, and mysteriously, the coffin became lighter, allowing them to hand it over for her loved ones to give her a Christian burial. They left the cemetery to return to the funeral home, but on the way back, Alejandro couldn't resist asking his colleague what he had said to the young lady when he approached the coffin. The colleague replied, "I just told her the truth. Miss, we have arrived at the place where you will rest. Be at peace, your family is waiting for you. It's only a farewell for now. When God decides, we will all join you at some point. Please help us finish our job so you can be with your loved ones, and we will pray for you." This is a reality. After all, it is true that many deceased individuals do not want to leave this world, and they struggle to say goodbye. They find a way to cling to this plane and make it known in a very particular manner. Hello friends, how are you? It's great to see you here again. I believe we all know about the various incidents that happen on the highways of the United States. Nurses, witches, animals running alongside cars, and entities chasing families in the middle of nowhere, in the darkness of the night or under the moonlight. On today's broadcast, we will share with you some stories from the rulers of the roads. Yes, I'm referring to the truckers who traverse and trace the entire state at all hours of the day. Let's begin. You are listening to Dark Secret. Are you ready for this? My Uncle Victor died at a young age of 44. Just like my dad and my grandfather, he was also a trucker and followed the family tradition of taking the country's roads and transport routes for many years. As a truck driver during that time, he had never experienced anything strange, just witnessing accidents and animals crossing the road, which is quite common during the night. Sometimes, unintentionally, he would hit them with the grill of his Kenworth T800. However, that would all change one night when he was driving towards Denver. At that time, due to the scale of violence prevailing on the highways, truckers were prohibited from stopping, standing still, or even picking up hitchhikers at stops and along the roads. My uncle was a calm and dedicated person to his work. He was never fearful or easily scared, claiming to have seen it all on the roads. But that particular night, after a long journey, many things would change for him. He said he was on a high mountain road. Suddenly, the radio started to have a lot of static, and the CB band was the same, eventually losing the signal completely. However, sometimes he could hear faint voices in the distance, echoes of people trying to communicate, maybe fellow truckers. Some truckers who frequented that area often said that the mountains caused the interference. But there was something more, something strange that my uncle didn't like at all. Later, as he continued his journey, he became very drowsy and eager to reach his destination sooner. He recounted that after a sharp curve, his truck's headlights illuminated what seemed to be a person walking by the side of the road. It wasn't unusual to see people from time to time, but it was strange because she was in the middle of the mountains with no nearby towns or houses, in an area where there was nothing. His surprise grew as he approached, and he decided to slow down. He turned on the high beams and saw that the person was a woman. He thought she might be one of those women who walked along the roadside, picked up by truckers in exchange for some favors, but it was unusual for this mountainous area, far from any settlement, and especially for her to walk in complete darkness without any guidance. A sinister thought lodged in his mind, thinking that perhaps by giving her a ride, he could have a pleasant time with her in the cabin. He didn't hesitate and started pulling over, stopping a few meters away from the girl, close enough to illuminate her with the headlights. As he approached, he saw that she was a very attractive young woman, and her clothing accentuated her body's provocative curves, inviting one to lose themselves in them. Without wanting to miss the opportunity, he anxiously observed as the woman moved with a slow and feline gait towards him, asking for a lift to the nearest town. With a sweet and melodic voice, she pleaded for him not to leave her, as it was late, and she feared falling off the cliff or being stalked by one of the many nocturnal beasts in the mountains. Although, at first glance, my uncle couldn't distinguish the woman's features, he noticed that she had very penetrating and almost hypnotizing black eyes, which made him agree to give her a ride despite knowing that he couldn't do it and that the risk of losing his job with the company was quite high. After she got into the truck, he started the engine, and with some strangeness, he saw that she was carrying a large leather-bound book with pages that looked very old, with a yellowish-brown color. She placed this book between her legs and then rubbed her arms, indicating that she was feeling uncomfortable, probably from the cold. This action caused her dress to ride up a bit, revealing that she was not wearing any underwear or a bra. The young woman's attributes quickly diverted my uncle's thoughts, and he began to strike up a conversation with her to break the ice and persuade her in one way or another. She, being condescending, continued the conversation, talking about different things she had seen on the road. Throughout the conversation, the woman kept rubbing her arms, and my uncle took advantage of this to get a little closer, offering her some of the clothes he had in the back of the truck. Amidst the talk and laughter, things escalated a bit. However, the woman showed no signs of fear or distress about being in the middle of nowhere with a man thirsty for pleasure. This, truthfully, sounds very strange and almost like something from a horror movie, but that's how it happened. She did not refuse the lascivious caresses from that man. However, at the slight touch of his hands on the book's spine, he felt a burning cold, as if his skin had been scorched by dry ice. This made him shiver, and he quickly withdrew his hand from the place he was trying to grab, holding onto the steering wheel as he took a sharp curve. Shortly after taking it, an unusual cold filled the truck's cabin, and the woman made grimaces of displeasure, indicating that she felt a little dizzy. My uncle invited her to rest in the sleeper cabin, and without hesitation, she settled in the berth. My uncle began searching for a place to stop the truck, but to his bad luck, he was in the middle of the Sierra and accelerated to get out of that area as soon as possible and find a rest stop. The cold in the cabin became so uncomfortable that, despite having the heater on, it wasn't enough. After a while, he heard the woman mumbling something, murmuring under her breath. It seemed like she was in some kind of prayer. When he asked if everything was okay, she didn't respond in any way and continued with those strange whispers. Combined with the chilling feeling in the cabin, my uncle felt a great unease, as something was not right that night. Suddenly, the sweet voice he had heard before turned into a hoarse and hateful voice, cursing and saying strange things.
"It smells like pure shit in here,"
she said contemptuously. "What are you talking about, woman? How can you smell shit?" my uncle asked, perplexed, hearing her voice change completely, and he tried to find a rest stop. He saw a small clearing by the roadside. He parked the truck as best as he could and turned on the hazard lights, turning towards the sleeper cabin. He asked again what smelled like shit, as he couldn't perceive any nauseating odor. "Is that medal you're wearing and that Bible under the blanket? Get rid of them because I can't read my cursed book, you filthy pig." The woman said with utter disdain. This statement greatly shocked my uncle, and suddenly a strong stench filled his nose. Indeed, it smelled like rancid excrement and aged urine. He moved closer, trying to bear the stench, and when he turned on the light in the cabin, he felt his blood freeze as an electric shock ran from his head to his legs. Tremors shook his body, punishing his limbs. The sight of what was once a beautiful woman with alluring curves, now transformed into a haggard old woman with matted hair and greenish skin covered in filthy seams emitting a foul odor, was terrifying. My uncle almost vomited at the sight of the transformation from a beautiful woman to a repulsively ugly old woman. Her obscene dress revealed a repulsive mass of hair that protruded from between her legs, where she rested the end of the book. That place seemed to emit some kind of vapor, which also caused a very strange stench. Terrified and disgusted, my uncle immediately got off the truck and opened the cabin hatch, struggling with the old woman, who tried to stay inside. After a struggle, he managed to pull her out, hitting and cursing her, and he lifted her with all his strength to throw her off the cliff. The old woman fell rolling down the rocks and bushes, disappearing into the darkness, screaming in pain and cursing my uncle. He then took the blanket that covered the mattress and used it to wrap up the strange book, which he also threw off the cliff. He ran as fast as he could and got back into the truck to get away from there as quickly as possible. The engine roared, accelerating the truck, while he prayed and clung to the steering wheel, constantly checking the mirrors and sweating profusely. He wished with all his soul that the disgusting old woman wouldn't follow him or climb onto the truck bed. The journey was long and terrifying, and when he finally left the Sierra to reach the first town, he felt relief and a little calmness. Nervous and still nauseous, he had the truck, the cabin, and the sleeper cabin washed to remove the stench that haunted him for several weeks. Since that day, no trip was ever the same for my uncle. He would comment that every curve resembling the one from that night reminded him of the experience he had lived. He spent the rest of his life living in fear of encountering that woman again and would break out in cold sweats when passing through the same spot late at night. A lot of time passed before he could recover from that encounter. After retiring from the roads and before he passed away, he told us this story, starting with much trepidation, recounting how he had encountered a witch on the road. Thank you for listening. Sugar Halls. Hello, friends. I recently discovered your channel and I decided to share a terrifying experience I had on the road. I hope you never go through what I experienced that night. I am a trucker, and from a young age, I started in this profession. My late father used to take me on his trips along the country's roads, and I learned to drive a truck as soon as I could reach the pedals. I became an experienced trucker like my father and worked for many companies. I never experienced anything strange, nothing beyond all sorts of accidents caused by the recklessness or stupidity of some people. I carried many passengers in my cabin, from whom I learned things, and they told me stories about roads and legends that you could find in towns through which I commonly passed, but nothing unusual happened to me. I didn't see anything strange for many years. But my luck ran out, and I experienced something that left a mark on me for a long time, and I still remember and feel uneasy about it. At that time, I was living in New Orleans and started working for a sugarcane line that transported sugar. I was driving a Kenworth with the trailer full of the product. I left Louisiana heading to Pennsylvania. The road was quiet and without any incidents. As I approached the delivery point, there was a military checkpoint where a long line of truckers were waiting to be inspected. It was unavoidable, so I relaxed and waited for my turn. Fortunately, we passed through quickly, but something strange happened. When I was at the checkpoint, a soldier asked me to step out of the truck while others inspected the cabin and asked me where I was heading. I answered that I was heading to Pennsylvania to deliver sugar. They checked my documents, the manifest, and seconds later, I was driving again. I felt like I had driven about 6 kilometers when, in the distance, I saw something coming along the roadside. It was early in the morning, so I flashed my high beams, and as I got closer, I realized it was a woman with strange red hair, wearing a white floral dress and a denim jacket. Her flat-top shoes were shining in a peculiar way. The weirdest thing was that she seemed to be standing by the roadside without moving and staring ahead. I felt some fear because when you see people like that, there's a risk they might throw themselves under the truck's wheels. So, I flashed my light several times as a warning and slowed down to be cautious. But as I passed her, I noticed that she was facing away from me, which didn't seem strange because I had seen her looking ahead before. All I could see was her red hair and the dress fluttering in the wind. Thinking that maybe she needed help, I did what I wasn't supposed to do, but curiosity got the best of me and I stopped a few meters ahead. There wasn't much traffic, so it wasn't a problem to stop. I got off the truck and ran towards the girl. When I saw her, I noticed that she had her head lowered, seemingly sad or preoccupied. As I approached, I asked if she was okay or if I could give her a ride. But when I mentioned the ride, the girl turned around in a very strange way. It was quite fast, as if reality was seen frame by frame, and in an instant, what was supposed to be the face of a beautiful young woman turned out to be nothing. There was an enormous dark and eerie hole in the middle of her head. Seeing this, fear overwhelmed me, and I backed away, trying to get away from that horrible sight. I fell to the ground as I looked at that thing with its face pointed directly at me. I crawled back, never taking my eyes off her. When I stood up, I ran as fast as I could, with my heart pounding out of my chest. I got back into the truck, and as I drove off, I didn't want to look back, but in the rearview mirror, I felt like the faceless girl would suddenly reappear. I concentrated and revved the engine to the maximum to gain speed and get away as far as possible. It was something I couldn't believe, but I had seen it, and I felt so cold that I began to shiver and feel sick to my stomach. When I finally reached Pennsylvania, several truckers were already waiting to unload. I parked the truck and got off, vomiting. I felt terribly ill and was shaking uncontrollably. Some truckers who were nearby approached me and asked me what was wrong. I couldn't speak, so I sat down and took some water they offered me. After calming down a bit, I started to tell them what I had seen on the road before arriving. I expected them to look at me strangely or think I was a drug addict or crazy, but instead, they looked at me sympathetically. The oldest one said that, indeed, a faceless woman always appeared in that stretch. According to local folklore, the woman had been run over at that spot, and her head had been smashed to pieces. However, others had a more believable version. They said that the young woman had been thrown in that spot, and the trucker who had thrown her used a sledgehammer to crush her face, which perhaps explained the terrifying appearance of her face. The truth is that no one gave me a convincing reason to believe them or to explain this paranormal situation. I didn't want to know more about the matter, and after delivering the merchandise, I had to return to the company. I spent many days unable to sleep, having nightmares, and feeling like the girl was getting into the cabin. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see her sitting next to me. Undoubtedly, that had me quite tense, and my family had to calm me down from my fright. I seemed to have calmed down a bit, but then they sent me again to carry sugar to Louisiana. That made me very nervous, and I didn't want to panic, so I composed myself and drove without any further issues. It was around 10 o'clock at night when I once again stopped at the military checkpoint. A soldier who came to inspect me asked me the same question as before, and I answered the same way. But when I mentioned my destination, he looked surprised, and a smile appeared on his face, which made me uncomfortable. He asked if I had crossed myself before leaving for Louisiana, and I replied that I had, but I felt like trembling. I told him I always did it because I knew there were many criminal problems in the area. The soldier responded with a chilling affirmation, "Well, yes, criminals, but besides that, several truckers and buses have reported seeing the dead girl appearing on the stretch ahead. We sent a patrol, but we can't do anything about supernatural matters." Without saying anything else, he kept laughing while I started sweating in my hands. I didn't want to see that disturbing woman again. I started the truck and drove away quickly. Just as I was about to cross the stretch where I had seen that spirit or demon dressed as a woman, I was relieved to see that there was nothing there. I passed without looking back and thanked God for sparing me from seeing her again. That's what I was thinking when, in the rearview mirror, I saw something peering from the back of the trailer. It was the perforated head of the young woman. Seeing this, I gave a slight swerve that almost sent me off the road. This was impossible. I looked again, and she was gone. When I arrived back in Pennsylvania, I was in a terrible state again. Fear clouded my mind, and I couldn't even maneuver the truck, so some colleagues had to help me that night. You'll understand that I didn't want to return immediately. I waited until dawn to return, and as soon as I did, I quit the company. I never drove in those parts again out of fear that something would appear on the road. Good night. Before anything else, it's important for you to know how I got into this profession. Like the majority of people or colleagues, we ended up here out of necessity, hunger, and in my case, to help my brothers and my mother since my father died during a raid at a plantation, as you can probably imagine. My father was friends with the person in charge of crop collection, so as soon as they heard about my father's passing, they wasted no time inviting me to work with them. We had earned their trust, and they knew us well. I returned home with some doubts about the invitation, but what could I do? Now I was the man of the house. My mother had tears in her eyes and told me not to do it, warning me that I might end up like my father or even worse. I found myself in a complex dilemma because I couldn't let my family die of hunger. So, I had to take the path to protect my family. The next day, when I arrived at the field, I noticed Jonas was already sitting under the shade of a tree by the roadside. I knew he was there to get my answer, so I tried to negotiate as best as I could. We all know that once you get into this, getting out is nearly impossible. Jonas said to me, "What's up, buddy? Have you thought about what I told you the other day? Have you decided to lift your family out of misery, or will you stay a laborer forever? Remember, some are born to labor and others to sell. This is your chance." He also mentioned that they had known my dad for a long time, and the boss admired his honesty and straightforwardness. My father earned his place through hard work and responsibility, and that's why they were here for me. Jonas gave me the choice to decide whether I'd join or end it right there. I tried to convince him to let my brothers continue working for the boss in the fields, and once I became the best at what I did, I would retire them. This profession is hereditary, and I didn't want my mother or brothers to be pressured in the future. When I achieved a position of power, I wanted to take them away from the town. Luckily, the boss accepted my proposal. So, I would soon begin my training to become the best at whatever they assigned me to do. It was during this time that the paranormal experiences began, spanning 30 years of doing everything, and when I say everything, I mean everything. My first paranormal experience happened during a guerrilla tactics practice. In simple terms, we were being trained on how to defend ourselves at night, in the jungle, amid the dense vegetation and darkness, illuminated only by the moonlight and some self-made sounds. Another crucial point to mention is that just as the Army is aware of new techniques and technologies, so are we. That's why, on that occasion, the boss hired someone quite important and renowned for combat tactics, torture, and internal security. Frankly, with that person, I learned what a human is capable of to maintain control over territory and keep the competition in check. That night, we were practicing techniques that involved dividing the team, a kind of personnel distribution that gradually surrounded the target. Before we began, one of our superiors jokingly warned us to beware of the witches in the area. He said that on previous occasions, they had caused teams to shoot each other. As our superior explained that night, a witch had supposedly taken the form of a knight. They quickly identified him as a stranger to the team and radioed to inquire about the characteristics of that individual. Indeed, he didn't belong to the group. The pursuit began, and that witch played with the minds of our comrades, causing some to shoot their own teammates. One witness affirmed that the witch had stood right in front of him, and despite the colleague's insistence that he should stop and explain his presence, the dark figure merely stared at him intently. Suddenly, the giant shadow lunged at him, and our colleague had no choice but to fire his weapon. When the creature reached him, it vanished completely. Once the mist dissipated, our colleague saw at a distance that a lump had fallen to the ground. With some fear, he approached to see if he had hit the target, and when he arrived, he realized that it was his own teammate lying on the ground. It didn't just happen to him. Other members mentioned similar occurrences, actions that led them to shoot their fellow team members. We would later be shown the place where they had to dig and bury them. They saw us as valueless objects. What disturbed us even more was that the local fauna had dug and, with the help of the superior's lamp, we could see some remains like hands and a skull that, as you can imagine, no longer had any skin or soft tissue. As best as we could, we covered the hole while holding our noses and mouths because, as you can imagine, the smell was far from pleasant. After this brief warning, we started our training, and I felt that, like me, some of my comrades felt as if someone was following or watching us throughout the exercise. The minutes felt like an eternity, but none of us had the luxury of feeling afraid, as we were all competing to climb the ranks or levels. A few extra bucks in the wallet never hurt anyone. Some comrades decide to entrust themselves to the Santa Muerte, Saint Death, others to the generous bandit or the crazier one known as Nazario, but I chose to stick with the father of the entire universe, especially when all those paranormal events occurred, which we will unravel throughout this document. I want to clarify that I don't feel nor am I a good person. I know that at some point, I'll have to pay for everything I've done, and believe me, I have no regrets. You'll also understand that anyone who decides to take this path knows what they're getting into. We finished quite tired but very pleased with the results of the exam. To celebrate, our superior had prepared dinner for us, and as you know, some beers couldn't be missing to toast and finally take the next step in our training. After drinking and dining, we prepared to rest since the next day would involve some practices with clubs and paralyzing belts. I can't describe everything else, but I know you can imagine it perfectly well, methods to make people talk. Each one chose where to spend the night, so we settled into rest while the lower-ranking members kept watch that night. We never imagined who we would face later on. I think it was around 2 in the morning when a fellow comrade's screams woke us up alarmingly. At first, we felt that our security had been compromised, so we grabbed our tools of the trade to defend ourselves. We quickly followed the sound of our comrade, who kept screaming alarmingly. We formed a formation and went to his rescue, only to realize that something or someone was pulling him by the feet through the grass. Our comrade managed to grab onto a small tree, but that thing kept pulling him. One of our team members started firing shots at that shadow, which seemed like something out of a horror movie. When the lamps illuminated it, the form vanished as if it were mist or smoke. But things didn't end there. We began to hear laughter that changed position as if jumping from one tree to another. We quickly grabbed our comrade and hurried back to the camp while those laughs kept changing places. An odd thing was that our friend seemed quite weak, as if all his energy had been drained. He couldn't walk. We had to support him, another member, and me. But the most terrifying part comes now. Suddenly, those laughter among the trees ceased to be heard, but we could clearly feel that something heavy fell to the ground. We looked in the direction where the sound came from and noticed that the grass was rapidly opening towards us, but there was no one to aim at. You might think I'm crazy, but my comrades and I know what happened to us that night. Seconds later, that strange force began again to try to take our comrade away. We had to hold him between several of us because that entity which had tremendous strength. It felt like hitting or impacting something that you can't see or something beyond human comprehension. Little by little, we gained ground until that dark being left our comrade alone. I have to admit that none of us slept for the rest of the night. We thought we had escaped those witches that night, but no, we were very wrong. They waited until we were vulnerable to play their tricks. It's time to subscribe and activate the bell. You would help us a lot. Years later, the next paranormal incident happened to us on the road. That night, we had to guard a heavy shipment, so as usual, we followed the cargo at a safe distance to avoid drawing attention. We were a little behind schedule, so the truck driver started going a bit faster. After a few hours, we spotted a woman walking along the roadside in the distance. We thought nothing of it, as it's quite common to encounter people with mental health issues on the roads in the state. We started joking about the situation since it was clear that the person had long and unkempt hair, walked barefoot, and gazed downward while her hands were intertwined around her belly. "Look, it's your old lady Cheo. Tell her you let her work in peace, send her home," I said to the truck driver with a smile as we continued our way. A few minutes later, things took a dark turn as that woman appeared again on the roadside. We fell silent for a few seconds because not long ago, we had left her behind. A chilling feeling ran through our bodies when that woman turned to look at us, her eyes resembling those of dogs or cats when you shine a light on them. The worst part was when she started screaming, but her voice wasn't normal. It had a disturbing guttural sound. Out of nowhere, that woman started running at a frightening speed, and to this day, we can't explain how she managed to catch up with us. She jumped and grabbed onto my side while showing us her mouth with rotted teeth and a tongue that was far from normal. I pulled out my tool of the trade and didn't hesitate to use it several times, even though we were left partially deaf and with discomfort for several weeks. But that horrific woman seemed completely unaffected. The projectiles did nothing to her. It was as if the bullets passed right through that thing. I can't deny that. Despite how tough we are, we screamed on some occasions because that thing wouldn't get off the vehicle. To make matters worse, after the glass broke from the shots, it stuck its face inside while moving its oversized tongue in all directions. I tried to land some punches on that thing, but my fists only hit the door frame. It was like punching through mist, something very similar to cotton candy, but extremely terrifying. I attempted to open the door to throw it onto the pavement, and just as we passed across on the roadside, that woman disappeared. After calming down a bit and a few days later when the ringing in our ears had subsided, we were able to talk and concluded that the woman possibly died at that location. We try to be strong in many things because that's what we're trained for, but how do you fight against supernatural things that truly exist? The last horror story will leave you thinking tonight, so enjoy this broadcast. The next paranormal incident involves people with the ability to transform into different animals. I also used to think they were mere legends or hallucinations of the elderly, since my father had told me about some quite strange situations involving these beings commonly known as nawalis. That night, we were guarding a merchandise production as the authorities had recently raided some stations in the vicinity. The product was in constant motion, so we couldn't afford to stop producing. It would mean losses for the boss, and we'd get into serious trouble. The workload for those working in production was quite heavy, and they couldn't afford to take time off to go home and eat something. I selected some guys, and we went down from the mountains to take them for dinner. We got some aguachiles and shrimp empanadas and soon set out on our way back to the base. We arrived and fed all the workers. They finished their meals, and one man around 40 or 45 years old asked for permission to go to the bathroom. For security reasons, no one can wander alone at that time. We don't know if they are informants or if the security has been compromised in some way, so I accompanied him to make sure he genuinely needed to relieve himself. I gave him about 15 or 20 meters to continue, and he positioned himself behind the first tree he found. A few seconds later, I heard him vomiting and making some quite strange sounds. I quickly approached him to see what was happening. When I was about 5 meters away from him, I noticed quite disturbing things. I saw his hand, and the nails were quite large, something they hadn't been seconds before. His voice transformed from cries of pain to pig-like and human sounds. Just as I stood in front of him, he looked at me, and my body froze for a few seconds. When that person turned his face towards me, I identified a pair of large fangs like those of a wild boar. His nose also showed a rather strange swelling. As soon as I grabbed my tool, this person jumped into the underbrush, but now on all fours. I heard him move away from me, trying to escape. I quickly communicated with the team to try to stop him or see what he had turned into. One of the guys had the opportunity to fire some shots at that creature, but it didn't stop. The next day, we found his clothes in the direction of the nearest town. We asked the workers who this person was, trying to identify him and pay him a visit to understand what it was all about, but it was not possible. The guy said he had only started working with us recently and was an undocumented person from the southern part of the state. We never heard from that person again, but I can vouch for the fact that the nawalis still exist among us. The last experience I will tell you about this time seems straightforward, but it's not. Many of us have heard horror stories about La Llorona and the horrible things that happen regarding this topic, but my horror story surpasses the classic events related to it. That night, we were in the town guarding the boss. He was attending a very important meeting, so we had to wait for him to finish. It was around 3 in the morning when I looked in the rearview mirror and saw a woman at the corner of the street. Her body emerged from under a tree, camouflaging herself. I quickly communicated it through the radio because I didn't want to be taken by surprise. Sometimes the opposing team resorts to so many tricks, like using children, elderly people, and of course, women. As soon as I gave the alert, we started hearing some lamentations. That thing wasn't saying, "Oh, my children," like everyone tells it. I feel it's a lie because we all heard wailing, like of pain. Quite the opposite of searching for her children. Everyone had already located that woman, but we started to get a bit nervous when we saw her walking or floating towards us. Something quite disturbing was that whenever her silhouette passed under a streetlight, her body would disappear, only to reappear when darkness fell. As I mentioned before, we are trained to overcome many things, but not the paranormal. However, I can tell you that many bosses in this line of work have the habit of performing protective rituals and other things that I might tell you about later. That woman kept advancing, and her wail sounded closer with each passing moment. Another myth I had heard was that the further you hear her, the closer she is, and vice versa, but it's not always true. That thing was getting closer, and it was clear that the sound increased as the apparition moved in front of us on the other side of the street. Based on my previous experience on the road, as I mentioned earlier, I grabbed my St. Benedict medal and crossed myself while watching that floating silhouette of a woman pass in front of the trucks. She continued straight ahead for a few more blocks until she dissolved. As soon as the boss came out, we told him what had happened, but, of course, he didn't believe us. What I'm about to tell you happened to me in a municipality in Puebla called Ajalpan in the Sierra Negra, where I am originally from. I remember I was about 8 years old at the time. I've only shared this with very few people, and only those very close to me. It's something that isn't easy to believe, but today I've decided to tell it again. This is what I experienced in that place. I was born in that municipality and lived there until I was 9 years old. After that, we moved to Tehuacan, and during vacations, some holidays, or long weekends, we would return to visit our relatives who still lived there. I liked it because where we had moved, there weren't as many animals as there were there. I used to play with my cousins. I only have one younger sister, so I enjoyed going to play in the countryside. I had a lot of fun, especially when my dad's cousin, Uncle Fermin, would prepare grilled corn on the coals for us, which I enjoyed immensely. I can't forget that during the time we lived in Ajalpan, strange things happened that I didn't understand. Well, my age and being distracted by games in the hills and fields made me think that I was imagining things. I overheard some adults talking among themselves in hushed voices, thinking that the children around weren't paying attention to their conversations. And indeed, we weren't, but now, after all this time, I've come to understand many things that became clear to me, including what happened one night with my Uncle Fermin. I remember that May 10th was approaching, and we were going to visit my grandmother to celebrate along with my aunts and my mom. I wouldn't be going to school, so we would spend a long weekend in that place that was beginning to turn dark and frightening. We were very excited, as our entire family had been looking forward to it. They were going to prepare turkey mole and tamales. Of course, there would be traditional sweets, and without fail, our grilled corn. So, we prepared in advance to get to our little village. We were very happy on the way. I was already thinking about what I would do with my cousins when we arrived. My parents were talking about how much they missed their home and how they would enjoy the family celebration. It had been a while since we had visited, so it was a good reason to do so. I was eager to start playing like any child. The only thing I didn't like, and that I remembered at that very moment, was that the adults didn't let us go out to play when it started to get dark. They said that since there was little light, we could get lost, or someone from outside could take us. This didn't seem possible to me because it was a small place. There were houses around, many cornfields and crops, as well as several pens where they kept cows, horses, and various animals for sale and food. They had pigsties, turkeys, chickens, and more. In short, that's what most of the residents were involved in, not kidnapping children. We arrived in the afternoon, just in time for lunch. We were received with as much excitement as we had for the visit. After greeting my uncles and grandparents, I ran off in search of my cousins. I didn't want to waste any time. While running towards one of the nearby cornfields, Uncle Fermin approached me. He greeted me with great enthusiasm and said, "Hello, Tonito, how are you? It's so nice to see you, son." He patted my shoulder, and I told him I was fine and that I was looking for my cousins. He pointed to the place where they were playing and said, "They're behind the trees." I started running desperately to meet them, and I heard his deep voice from behind, saying that I should get ready to eat the grilled corn because it was waiting for me. He finished with a loud laugh, and I just raised my thumb as a sign of approval without stopping my run to meet my cousins. Exactly when I arrived at the avocado trees where they were playing, I saw my cousin Manuel, Elena, Victor, and Cecilia. When I called out to them, they came to meet me. We greeted each other and immediately continued playing and talking about what we would do during my short visit with my parents. The afternoon went on until we were called for dinner. We sat down, and my parents and uncles talked about how things were going for us in Tehuacan. Everything was going well. While we were eating, I told my cousins that I would like to see the animals for a while, and they surprised me by saying that they had some puppies now. We hurriedly finished our portions. Afterward, we told them that we would go outside for a while to see the things that we knew I liked very much. However, my grandmother said we couldn't stay outside too late and that we should go in the morning before it got dark. At that moment, my uncle Fermin replied that we didn't need to worry because no one could enter our pens, but it was still a good idea to listen to our grandmother. After much insisting, we left in the company of an uncle, just as my grandmother had said. We took a few rounds, and before it got dark, he told us we would come back in the morning to continue showing me more animals. During the short tour, he showed me the 3 horses and told me the brief history of the puppies, how they had come on their own and were later adopted, and how much they had grown attached to them. So, we all returned to my grandmother's house, talking, and later, we had dinner. My uncle Fermin was carving a little figure on a piece of wood, something he loved to do and was quite good at. He told me, without taking his eyes off what he was carving, that he would accompany me with my cousins to the cornfield for the grilled corn tomorrow. I was very excited, and my dad said, "Don't spoil him too much, Uncle," and laughed heartily. We had dinner and went to bed. As the night wore on, I began to hear the barking of dogs and the occasional howl. It woke me up, and they continued for a few minutes, barking as if they were seeing someone. After a while, they quieted down. What struck me as strange was that no one else woke up. I looked at my parents and my little sister, and they were all peacefully asleep. I assumed it was just my restless imagination. Then, I heard some barefoot footsteps, but it seemed that for that night, that was all. I stayed awake for a while with my eyes open, thinking, and at some point, I didn't even realize when I fell asleep again. The next day, during breakfast, no one mentioned anything about the howling and the noises, so I figured I must have been the only one who heard them. I didn't need to pay it much attention. After all, in a small village like that, and with the stillness of the night, anything could happen. My grandmother interrupted my thoughts, telling me to hurry up and finish breakfast so that we could accompany my uncle to the cornfield. I rushed like my cousins. We wouldn't miss going to the cornfields. It was fun, and we liked it even more because Uncle Fermin would play games with us or tell us stories about our ancestors. He always said that some of them were special and knew how to cure illnesses and other things, that they knew about herbs, and that all of this knowledge dated back to pre-Hispanic times. Those were very interesting conversations we had with him, so we didn't want to waste any time. We hurried and left with our palm baskets to bring back the corn and roast it over the wood fire in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the aunts, my mom, and my grandmother prepared all the ingredients for the mole. It would be a delicious meal for May 10th, Mother's Day. After finishing cutting all the corn we would need, Uncle Fermin asked us to sit around him. With some apples that we had picked from the trees, he said he would tell us about some of the activities that were done in the past. While we enjoyed our fruits, he told us that in those times, his ancestors could communicate with nature. They would connect with it and ask for permission to hunt, gather fruits, and harvest crops. Nature, he said, was like another mother to us, providing us with food, clothing, and even plant-based medicines. But it also gifted some of us with special powers, something like magic, that we should always be grateful for and learn from. I compared it to asking a tree for permission to eat its fruit or take something from the earth, and Uncle Fermin said it was somewhat like that. We talked about other things, and then we returned to the house to prepare the bonfire for the corn and see how everything was going. From a distance, we could see smoke rising from my grandmother's adobe kitchen. It also smelled of chilies and turkey broth. They were already cooking it. We entered to leave the corn in a corner and saw my mom and aunts busy moving around. It was quite a tradition to do all of this. My grandmother acted as the conductor, giving them instructions while she checked the clay pots and griddles. Their tasks had piled up because the next morning they would start early with handmade tortillas. They already had the nixtamal ready. So, they were preparing quite a feast for these occasions. We hurried to go outside so as not to interrupt them and started playing in the little dirt courtyard outside the house. All my uncles and my father were placing the firewood while chatting. We overheard that they were planning to visit the animals later, as they wanted to do something in addition to preparing mole and tamales. I think from what I overheard, they needed something more for everything to be complete. We continued with our own activities, and the adults were busy with the preparations. By then, it was customary to invite the neighbors, so they were making a lot of food. By the afternoon, I was eagerly looking forward to the corn. Uncle Fermin had already prepared the embers to start placing the corn. We children helped carry them for him to put on the fire. The smell was delicious, the corn leaves toasting slowly and getting crunchier with each passing moment. We were all sitting, waiting for them to come out one by one, while talking about the food and the neighbors. The evening passed peacefully, and everyone was very happy. But I had no idea what awaited me that night. I would see something that I couldn't understand until years later when I became an adult, and here's what happened. When we finished everything that night, we went to bed. Since I had been busy cutting corn, picking fruits, and playing with my cousins, I fell deeply asleep. But again, I woke up, and I didn't know the time. It wasn't the dogs this time, it was because I had drunk too much water, and to make things worse, the bathroom was still outside. I was quite desperate. It wasn't far, and it was quiet, but I didn't want to make any noise. I couldn't hold it any longer, so I got up slowly, trying not to wake anyone. I slipped out and walked very slowly to exit the house to reach the bathroom. Everything was calm. My little sister woke up, saw me, and then went back to sleep in my mom's arms. I breathed a sigh of relief and continued toward the exit. I opened it as quietly as I could and went outside to the small bathroom. I was a bit sleepy, and there was some cold air. I was almost done when I heard some noises among the bushes. It frightened me a bit, but then I remembered it must be the dogs because I hadn't heard them barking or howling earlier. Maybe they were hungry. Then I heard some footsteps, but they weren't human. They sounded like hooves, and it was hard for me to mistake it. I had grown up around animals, and if it wasn't a horse, it was something similar because I could hear the sound of hooves. I peeked through the gaps in the wooden walls and sheets of the bathroom before stepping out, and I saw something different from what I had imagined. I saw a donkey circling among the shrubs that surrounded the house. I could tell it was a donkey from its ears and tail. It kept going in and out, as if pulling something that was causing it trouble. What struck me as odd was that my family didn't own a donkey. They had shown me the animals. They had 3 horses, as I mentioned earlier, but no donkeys. So, I thought it might belong to a neighbor. I wasn't afraid to go outside because I was used to dealing with animals, but I became engrossed in watching what the animal was doing there. However, I started feeling colder. I thought that if I went outside, the donkey might get scared and make noise, waking everyone up. They had worked hard and were planning to wake up early, from what I had overheard, to make tortillas and everything else. So, I decided to wait a little longer for the strange animal to leave. After a while, it finally emerged from the thicket, and I could see that it had been dragging something. It was clear that whatever it was heavy. It dropped it and then picked it up again with its snout. Then, it turned in the direction of the house. This reassured me somewhat because in the darkness, it wouldn't see me, and as long as I stayed quiet, it wouldn't wake anyone. I continued to observe it as silently as possible, but what startled me the most was that as it got closer, I noticed certain human-like features on the donkey. It had human eyes, and its front legs resembled larger forearms, though they ended in hooves instead of feet. It was very strange. I had never seen such an unusual animal, especially one with the strength to carry a pig. Although the pig wasn't very big, it seemed quite heavy. Here came the donkey, and I shrank back, as if thinking it might see me spying on it. However, I only heard its footsteps passing by the bathroom. I huddled up, pulling my knees to my chest, hoping that its footsteps would stop. It took a moment, and when I no longer heard them, I peeked out again to see if it had gone, so I could leave and run back to my grandmother's house. As I peeked out again, I saw the animal drop what it was carrying. Then, it made a sort of groaning sound, but it didn't sound like an animal. It was more like a human's exclamation of fatigue. This scared me even more. So, I took the opportunity to slip out quietly, closing the door slowly behind me. I made sure it didn't see me, and I ran back to the house. I entered quickly and jumped onto the bed. My mother was startled and asked if something had happened. I told her I had gone to the bathroom and that it was cold outside. I didn't want to tell them what I had seen. I was feeling drowsy, and they might not believe me, they might think I had imagined it. So, I reassured them that everything was fine, and she told me to go to sleep. But I couldn't sleep until much later because I couldn't get that image out of my mind, a donkey with human-like features. The next day, still with that image in my mind and feeling a bit tired because I hadn't slept well, I got up. They called us for breakfast, but I didn't have much appetite, and they thought it was because I was looking forward to the midday meal. Everyone was happy, and my cousins asked me to play with them, but I told them I could only play for a little while because I wasn't feeling great. They understood. After playing for a while, we were called to eat. The food was delicious, but there was something that kept me thinking for a while. I think they noticed because one of my uncles made a comment that left me pensive. He thanked Uncle Fermin for the pig. Uncle Fermin said it hadn't been easy to find one because not all the neighbors had one to sell, but he had managed to get it from another community. When I heard this, I nearly choked on the candy I was eating. Everyone looked at me, but Uncle Fermin, in particular, smiled at me and asked if I was okay. Again, I told them I was fine and that I would go play again. The event ended, and at night, I heard the dogs barking again. This time, my mother noticed it too. She just said that the dogs were restless because there were many people around, maybe that's why. Our time was up, so the next day, we would return home. We would only have breakfast at my grandmother's house and then head back to Tehuacan in the afternoon. In the morning, after breakfast, we went inside to pack our things, and my mom was in the kitchen getting some food for us to take, as is the custom in my little town. I took the opportunity to say goodbye to my cousins since I didn't know when we would return. Aside from the incident in the bathroom that night, I had a great time. I was cutting some fruit for the journey when I felt a heavy hand on my shoulder. I turned, and it was my Uncle Fermin. He smiled, took the apple one was reaching for, and handed it to me. He knelt down to be at my eye level, took me by the shoulders, and said the following: "Listen, my boy, there are things that are not comprehensible to the eyes of every man or to their understanding. But there are secrets that are passed down from generation to generation. Do you remember what I tell all of you about the powers of nature and what it gives us? There are things that we only understand when we grow older. There is much to learn. Some people are born special, with a privilege granted by Mother Nature. Others learn it. But it's all part of the life that many of us lead. Someday, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So, forget what you saw and enjoy your childhood. You'll understand one day, my boy, and you'll know that sometimes it's necessary to develop this gift." I just listened to his words and didn't understand much, but what I grasped was that there was something more to him, something he could do, something not everyone could practice. It was also a secret that had to be kept. After all, he knew that I had seen something that night, something, as he said, that not everyone could comprehend, and my family knew it too because no one tried to get up to see what was happening. He looked at me and continued, "The next time you visit, I'll prepare your favorite corn cobs for you again, and I promise you won't see the little donkey anymore. You'll have peaceful nights, you'll see." He smiled, gave me a kiss on the forehead, and patted my back. "Come on, my boy, go get your things with your parents and say goodbye to everyone." I looked into his eyes and said goodbye, goodbye, Uncle Fermin. Then, I ran towards my grandmother's house and turned back to wave at him. As the years went by and I continued visiting my grandmother's house, I gradually began to understand many of the things Uncle Fermin had explained. As a child, like he said, I couldn't quite grasp it, but later, especially after my grandmother passed away, I understood it all. Just as Uncle Fermin had said, I never saw the little donkey again in my subsequent visits until the night of my grandmother's wake. That night, in those moments, with all the grief we were feeling, I wasn't thinking about anything else. What I did was step outside to contemplate near the apple tree that was close to the house. Then, I heard the hoofsteps again, and I saw the bushes rustling. I walked towards them and saw something once more. It was the same donkey I had seen in my childhood. But this time, I saw it with its head hung low, and what no one could ever imagine was happening. It was crying. I saw tears slide from its eye, and it sobbed like a human, like a man experiencing the pain of losing a loved one. As I approached it silently, I turned back towards the house, leaving it in the quiet of the night to release its sorrow in complete privacy. I had to respect its grief. I also understood what Uncle Fermin had told me, that sometimes it was necessary for him to do that, as he was the guardian of the ranch. Being an animal, it was easier for him to move around at night and go unnoticed, among many other things that only he would understand. This secret would go with him one day when he departed. In the meantime, I would continue to keep it, and perhaps someday I would also learn to transform. You never know. Original story by Jemisha, the Goddess of Darkness. Dear friends, thank you very much for joining me in this broadcast. It would help me a lot if you subscribed by activating the notification bell and leave a thumbs up along with your comment. I'm always reading your comments to respond. And if you still have some courage left to hear another one of our horror stories, I'll leave one on the screen to accompany you for the rest of this night. See you in the next broadcast of Dark Secret.